Dan Schneider is suing for defamation over a docuseries that aired in March called Quiet on Set. He filed the 24-page complaint on Wednesday, May 1st in Los Angeles, so it is a defamation lawsuit, and he is suing for two things. Number one, he claims that the docuseries represented him to be a child S predator. He's also suing for defamation under the theory that the docuseries implied he was a criminal. So let's get into some more of the details. So, Dan Schneider is a prolific writer and producer, responsible for some of the most iconic and successful children's shows in history. And these shows include thousands of feet jokes featuring children. Anyway, most of his shows aired on Nickelodeon in a partnership that began in 1993 with Nickelodeon and Dan Schneider's production company, Schneider's Bakery. Dan's public working relationship partnership with Nickelodeon lasted more than 30 years until they finally parted ways in 2018. Now, there are different versions of the story given by different people as to what exactly were the reasons why Dan and Nickelodeon ended this highly lucrative and successful business relationship. According to the official press release statement from Nickelodeon, they were just parting ways so Dan could pursue other creative endeavors. But it doesn't appear that Dan actually ever went on to do that. Some former employees and actors alleged that the reason that Dan Schneider and Nickelodeon actually parted ways had more to do with the fact that Dan had allegedly created a hostile working environment. And other people have speculated, the rumors have swirled that the real reason Dan was let go is that he was allowing child to work on his sets. And the most extreme rumors and speculation allege that Dan himself perhaps engaged in some untoward behaviors toward children. In any event, and for whatever the reason, Dan and Nickelodeon did part ways publicly, at least in 2018, after more than 3 decades of working together. And even before this documentary came out, Dan Schneider had faced plenty of criticism from various sources for all kinds of activities and allegations. Over the years, many YouTubers and social media content creators have made videos about Dan and his progeny, pointing out how some of the jokes that we thought were funny as kids and some that went completely over our heads were actually not so ambiguous sexual jokes with a double meaning, and some were even legitimately depraved. But as innocent children, we missed that double meaning. So this docuseries picked up right where the YouTubers left off, highlighting a few instances of these types of jokes. And one example that was given was a character played by Amanda Bynes named Penelope Taint. Now, many child viewers of the show, even to this very day, did not even know that that was her name. They thought it was Penelope Tate, but it wasn't. It was taint. And taint is another word for an intimate part of the human anatomy, basically a private part, something that's not really appropriate joke for a child to be making. So in this docuseries, according to people who were working on the set, they basically claim that Dan Schneider knew exactly what he was doing with that joke. He did it on purpose, and he kind of laughed and told them not to tell the children what it really meant. And the docuseries participants kind of point to this as one of the rare instances where Nickelodeon did actually ask Dan Schneider what he was doing. Now, according to these former employees, Dan lied to Nickelodeon representatives and basically implied that it was them who were the perverts for even thinking of that. And he was saying they were trying to taint his joke. There were a lot more examples of stuff that they gave in the documentary. I mean, the thing ended up being 5, 6, 7 parts or something, but that's just one example, just to give you all the context. Now, on top of the shows that Dan wrote and produced to actually air on Nickelodeon, he also produced some less than sanctioned content of his own and published it to the public. Now, this non-sanctioned content would also begin to raise eyebrows. For example, Dan Schneider would tweet really weird stuff from his own personal Twitter account, but he would tweet about the shows he was working on and about the actresses and actors who he was working with. Some of the weird stuff he posted included pictures of children's bare feet, and he even went so far as to solicit pictures of children's bare feet from the children directly on this Twitter account. Other examples of this non-sanctioned content were the home movies that Dan would make from behind the scenes of his shows and publish them to various places. In one now infamous clip, we do see Ariana Grande and I think Victoria Justice kind of jumping whenever they realize Dan's coming in the room and they look scared. Y'all have probably seen that all over the internet by this point. And it wasn't just YouTubers and social media content creators who criticized Dan Schneider or Nickelodeon. It seemed that at least one former child star took issue with Dan as well. Jeanette McCurdy, one former child star who was a mainstay of the Nickelodeon universe for years.
My name is Samantha Puckett. I'm from Seattle and I love fried chicken. At just 15, Jeanette McCurdy was one of the most recognizable child stars on television, playing Sam Puckett in Nickelodeon's hit show iCarly.
Has been vocal about her disdain for the time that she spent on Nickelodeon and the work that she participated in.
But inside I was hurting. It was painful. I was angry. I felt unsupported.
She's done interviews over the years stating that she wasn't proud of anything she worked on at Nickelodeon and she hated all the roles that she had played. She basically kind of blames her mom, though, and says that as a child, she really didn't have any choice in the matter and she was forced to be a child actress. She also put out this weird Vine where she's like, "Look what you've done to me, Dan Schneider." Very strange. Very strange.
Hey, Dan Schneider. I know you're watching my Vine. Do you like my Vine? Vine. Look what you've done to me.
What she, I don't know what that was about. And then within the last year or two, she put out her autobiography, which was called "I'm Glad My Mom Died." And in this autobiography, she describes working with a producer on the Nickelodeon shows, and she describes some untoward behavior.
In her book, she writes that after Sam and Cat was canceled, Nickelodeon offered her a $300,000 thank you gift if she agreed to never speak publicly about her experience at the network, specifically with a man she refers to as the creator, who on one occasion, she says, encouraged her to drink while she was still underage and gave her a shoulder massage. In response, Nickelodeon telling ABC News, "We have no reportable response other than a no comment at this time."
And many people have speculated that the producer she's talking about is none other than Dan Schneider. Okay, so now the scene is set, pun intended, and that's basically the landscape of the situation leading into spring 2024. So in February 2024, this trailer comes out, and it heavily and predominantly features Dan Schneider.
In the early 90s, Nickelodeon was kid everything. And you better hope that your house had cable.
Wasn't there to educate you. We were there to have fun, to get slime, to be entertained.
And this is when Dan Schneider arrives, Nickelodeon's golden boy.
Advertises that a docuseries is going to be coming.
Thank you for being here.
But that marked one of the darkest chapters. Working for Dan was like being in an abusive relationship. Dan's treatment of people on his shows was an open secret.
And then the very next month, in March 2024, the docuseries does air in a 4-part 2-night event. So the first 2 episodes came out, and then on a different day, I think it was the next day, the next 2 episodes came out. And the producers of this documentary were the same people who produced the Framing Britney Spears documentary, which did air with the New York Times, FX, and all that. And this 4-part documentary featuring Dan Schneider went every bit as viral as the Britney Spears one. The docuseries was aptly named Quiet on Set, The Dark Side of Children's Television, and literally millions of people tuned in to watch the 2-night event. The docuseries reiterated and highlighted just how freaky and weird a lot of these jokes on Dan's shows really were. The producers of the documentary also interviewed many former child stars who had starred and acted in Dan's shows, and they also interviewed former employees of Dan Schneider. Now, of those children, the former children who are now adults who were interviewed, most of them had at least one horror story to tell. And the horror stories ranged all over the map, from descriptions of age and body discrimination, racist typecasting based on offensive stereotypes, humiliation and degradation disguised as stunts and dares, all the way up to allegations that some of these stunts and dares put the children's health and safety at risk. Notably, the docuseries pointed to 2 separate men who had worked on these shows who went on to be convicted or otherwise prosecuted for crimes against children.
There would be even bigger problems down the line with actual pedophiles on set. These are 3 predators who worked at Nickelodeon, all in a short amount of time. Oh my God. It's a house of horrors. They find this enormous trove of child. The officer said, "We found Ziploc bags, each one with a girl's name on it."
So 2 men worked on these shows who were convicted of child crimes. One of them was a man by the name of Brian Peck. He went by Pickle Boy. He was also acting and he would carry around a big tray of pickles. Girl, I don't really know. This man was convicted and served prison time for abusing at least one of the child actors on this set. Now, the docuseries also would feature the child victim of this man who's now an adult and would, ask him questions about it and stuff. That was Drake Bell. Then the docuseries mentioned this other man, Josh Handy, something Handy, kind of similar situation where he was participating in some untoward behaviors toward children. Now, in the docuseries, they do tell you that man went on after he got out of jail or after he got off probation or whatever he was doing, to go and continue working in children's television, but this time it would be at a different network. It would be at Disney. The docuseries also featured some of Dan's former employees, writers, and people on the show that would work under him. And these people made allegations against Dan himself. They accused him of all kind of untoward behaviors, including those of a S nature. These former employees described a working environment run by a tyrannical, unhinged maniac who wielded his power by forcing people on set, especially women, to perform humiliating, degrading, and deranged acts, or else they would be punished. And they might even be fired on the spot and blackballed through the entire industry because Dan was apparently so powerful.
The opportunities for women were fewer. You knew you were going in for the one spot.
Working on this new television show for Nickelodeon. So I just took a shot and I asked him if he would read my work. This was like a dream come true.
I had been in LA for 7 years. I was going to have to split a salary with a writer that I did not know.
So they were getting 2 for the price of 1.
For example, one of the former employees alleged that Dan would routinely force women in the production of his shows to stop their own workday and then come and give him a very public massage in the open in front of God and everybody. One woman, a former writer employed by Dan on one of the shows, who alleges she was only being paid a half salary when she started working for Dan. She spoke of an incident wherein she was forced by Dan to publicly emulate a certain S act while reading through a script that she had written.
Funny. Yes, but not funny, haha. Funny, weird.
Now, importantly, very importantly, in this docuseries, the former child star who was the victim of Brian Peck, remember the pickle boy, he went to jail for abusing the child and all that? That victim, who was a child at the time, he was in the documentary too, Drake Bell. And he was adamant in the docuseries that Dan Schneider never did anything to him or in front of him that he would consider to be in any way inappropriate. To the contrary, he said that whenever he was being abused by a child S predator on set, Dan Schneider was one of the only people who really had his back, who really cared about the trauma that he had endured. This was in the docuseries.
My name is Drake Bell, and I came here today to tell my story. But really, the only person that I remember being there for me was Dan.
In my opinion, I thought the documentary was pretty fair and balanced, at least in regards to Dan Schneider and any allegations being made against him. I actually kind of thought the documentary was a little bit too forgiving on Dan Schneider because it kind of offered up a bunch of people doing a bunch of different things that could be harmful, but not only to children, to adults, or anybody working on set. The docuseries made vague and conclusory sweeping statements about the solution to these problems being that the industry needs to examine itself. But after the 4 parts aired, Dan came out and made his own apology style video that certainly wasn't actually an apology, and it was a fiasco and a flop. I made a video on that too if you want to watch it. But anyway, then the whole P. Diddy raid situation happened in the meantime, and while the Dan Schneider allegations were still kind of bubbling on the back burner, people, I think, were kind of prepared to move on from the whole Dan Schneider saga and on to the next thing. Well, Dan Schneider apparently had other plans because yesterday afternoon, the headlines were buzzing yet again with his name and his big ass head, saying Dan Schneider had sued.
Dan Schneider, the former showrunner of some of Nickelodeon's biggest shows and focus of the hard-hitting docuseries Quiet on the Set, is now suing the producers for defamation. The doc highlights the dark side of the kids' cable network Nickelodeon and abuse of child stars, and Schneider now alleges the portrayal of him is a, quote, hit job. That implies he abused children who worked on his TV shows. In a statement Wednesday, he says he was regretful for his behavior as a producer and will continue taking accountability, but said had no choice but to take legal action.
So what is defamation in California? Before we even take the first step, you should just be aware that defamation cases are generally pretty difficult to win, but especially in California. And that's because at the heart of a defamation case is the fact that the person suing is suing over something somebody said. So, AKA speech. And the highest law in the land, the United States Constitution, protects our right to speak. Basically, the people who wrote the Constitution were trying to escape from a tyrannical and maniacal government that was punishing and hurting them for speaking out against the abuses they were facing. So after they won their freedoms from England, they really wanted to make sure that that never happened in this new country. So the First Amendment of the Constitution protects our right not only to free speech, but also to debate and freedom of the press. And press doesn't just mean if you have a journalism degree and work as a journalist. The freedom of the press right applies to all Americans who want to publicize information. Now, this right to free speech is especially constitutionally protected when the issue being discussed is an issue of important public interest or of a public figure, or when the speech involves discussion of a public figure. So that's just the regular Constitution. But Dan is suing in the state of California under the California defamation statute. And California has even more protections for free speech than even the Constitution alone by itself provides. They also have other laws in place, such as the anti-slap statute, which allows somebody who's getting sued for defamation to kind of sue back in a way, to get the lawsuit off the books and to get attorney's fees, and other things can happen.
A slap is a lawsuit that's used to intimidate or try and quiet critics. Forcing people to defend lawsuits can get pretty expensive. So a lot of states have passed what are called anti-slap laws. They're supposed to block people from using the courts to go after someone who's just exercising their First Amendment rights.
So let's look into what exactly Dan Schneider is going to have to prove in court if he stands a chance of winning on this case. So a defamation lawsuit in California can be brought as a libel or a slander action. So libel in California is defamation, and slander in California is defamation. Defamation is kind of the umbrella, and then things can fall under the umbrella. See what I mean? Well, Dan is suing for both. Now, the TLDR difference between libel and slander just has to do with the mode of the statement. So libel is something that is written, and slander is something that is spoken. So if Dan Schneider can prove either libel or slander on the part of these defendants that he's suing, then he can win this case. So what are the elements that he's going to have to prove? Well, pretty much libel and slander are indistinguishable from each other in the law. For the purposes of our conversation today, I mean, I think we could probably do a whole law class on this and we could really get down into the weeds. I'll put it a little side by side or whatever. But in general, defamation is a false, unprivileged publication, either in writing or spoken, that exposes a person to undue contempt and ridicule and stuff like that. And it actually has to harm the person. It can't just be a lie someone made up, it's a rumor, and it didn't harm him. Also, it doesn't necessarily only have to harm the person's reputation. It could also, if it harms their ability to make a living or their ability to run their business or something like that, that could count as harm for the harm element. Now, as you can see, the very first element in either libel or slander in the defamation action, the very first element in a defamation action is that the allegedly defamatory statement has to be false. It has to be a statement, and the statement has to be false. So a question is not defamation, speculation is not defamation, jokes and hyperbole that are obviously jokes are not defamation. It has to be a statement uttered as if it is a fact, and the statement that is uttered as if it is a fact must be false. If you're uttering a true statement, it doesn't matter if it hurts somebody's reputation. It's true. And the First Amendment allows us to speak the truth. And jokes and speculation and opinions and questions. So like I said, it's already going to be pretty hard for Dan Schneider to even win this case before we get to a single fact of the case, just because of how the free speech laws and things like that are set up. But Dan has another uphill battle, unfortunately for Dan, and that comes down to the difference between express statements and implied statements. There's two different types of statements that can be defamatory. The most obvious is an express statement. An express statement would be something like, John Doe is a convicted child S offender on a registry and he served time. Whenever John Doe didn't do any of those things and he's never been convicted. That's an express defamatory statement because I'm saying he's been convicted of a crime and he hasn't. I'm talking about John Doe, a hypothetical person right now, okay? So John Doe, let's say he's minding his business working down at the fruit stand or the farmer's market and someone's like, that's a convicted child S offender, this, and that, and none of that's true. Those are express statements. She's not saying, well, it's my opinion he should be convicted. It's my opinion he should be investigated. That's not, no. If you say he's been convicted already, he's a child predator, stuff like that, he's on a registry and none of that's true, well, those are express statements that can explicitly be proven false, right? There is another type of defamation statement, and that is the implied statement. And pretty much all of Dan Schneider's entire lawsuit, from what I can tell, relies on this implied thing, which is going to be very difficult to prove. It just is. Now, I'm not going to lie. I mean, y'all know how I feel about Dan Schneider. I'm no Dan Schneider apologist. I'm one of those YouTubers that was making videos about him. But some of the arguments that he and his lawyer do make, I think they're not completely frivolous, and we will get into those. So in addition to these express statements, there are implied statements or defamation by implication. And this area is a little more dicey and, like I already said, harder to prove. So in the lawsuit that he did file yesterday, I don't think I saw a single instance of express defamatory statements. We will read some parts of this together in just a moment, but it does appear to me as if every single count of alleged defamatory statements or whatever that Dan Schneider is alleging is this implied defamation. So before we look at the first word of the lawsuit, you should know that Dan Schneider is at the bottom of a 90-degree uphill battle. I mean, there's a lot of things stacked against him. He's a public figure. The issues are of public concern. The statements are not express defamatory statements. He's not even able to point to one. The documentary has the First Amendment right to freedom of the press because he's a public figure and it's an issue of public concern. The documentary never expressly stated that Dan Schneider was a child S predator or a criminal. And that's before we read the first word of the man's lawsuit. So let's pull that up right now. I do think that it is interesting that he is suing in the state of California, but one has to wonder why you would want to sue for defamation in a jurisdiction where you know it's going to be incredibly difficult to win, as opposed to suing in a different place. But it may be because he just wants to get to the point fast and he doesn't want to argue over jurisdiction. I don't really know. So as you can see here, it does say Dan Schneider is the one plaintiff. He is suing Warner Brothers Discovery. He is suing the actual production company that did produce the documentary or the docuseries, and this is the same company that did produce the Framing Britney Spears one. Also, Sony. He's suing Sony Pictures and the individual producers, Mary Robertson and Emma Schwartz. Now, he's also suing 50 other people, I don't know who, and he doesn't name them. So in the introduction, he says, this action arises out of the recent television docuseries, Quiet on Set, The Dark Side of Kids TV, in which defendants falsely state or imply that Schneider, a well-known television producer, creator, and or writer responsible for some of history's most beloved television shows, abused children who worked on his shows. These statements are fabrications. It says Quiet on Set's portrayal of Schneider is a hit job. And then he does admit it is indisputable that two bona fide worked on Nickelodeon shows. It is likewise indisputable that Dan had any knowledge of this abuse and he was not complicit. It goes on to say that he condemned the abuse once he discovered it or once passive voice it was discovered. And then it finally does explicitly state he was not a child S abuser himself. But for the sake of clickbait, ratings, and views, or to put it differently, money, these documentary people have completely destroyed Dan's reputation and legacy through the false statements and implications that he is exactly that. Now, this I thought was interesting right here, this paragraph 4, because what you get is Dan and his lawyers, they're already kind of anticipating what these documentary people are going to argue. And I think it's important just to reiterate, one of the defendants in this case is Sony. So they're going to come with the big in their defense. I would venture to wager that Sony has some of the best lawyers in the world. So of course they're going to be coming guns blazing to their defense. So apparently in anticipation of that guns blazing lawyers that are about to come down their necks, Dan and his lawyers kind of steal that thunder right here in the initial complaint. They say, no doubt the defendants are going to endeavor to obfuscate what this lawsuit is about by pointing to what they did get right. And Schneider, Dan, will be the first one to admit that some of what they said is true. At times, he was blind to the pain that some of his behaviors caused certain colleagues, subordinates, and cast members. He will regret and atone for this behavior for the rest of his life. But one thing he is not, and one thing that will forever mar his reputation and career, both past and present, is a child S. So they're saying, look, some of the stuff in that documentary is true. I did do some of that stuff. That was, bad and I regret it and all that. But one thing I'm definitely not. In his lawsuit, he says, is a child abuser. And that allegation in particular, that implication in particular, is marring his reputation. That's what he's saying. Okay. So then they kind of get into the history. This stuff I already kind of talked about. And then they include some precedent where another court in another California case has come out and defined what it looks like when you have an implication defamation situation. It says, if the defendant juxtaposes a series of facts so as to imply a defamatory connection between them or otherwise creates a defamatory implication, he can be held responsible for the defamatory implication. Okay, so what they're saying is like, yeah, if you put a bunch of series of facts together in order such that it's basically misleading and makes it into a false statement about somebody, then it could be defamation. And then they include some more case law and they say a photograph itself can convey both an implicit and an explicit message if the headline and the caption and the photograph taken all together are also a statement. So we're kind of getting a little bit into the weeds, but they give us, I think, a good example here. He says a photograph, especially when coupled with a text, can convey a powerful message because a picture is worth 1,000 words. And they give this example, quote, corn industry shuts down after female performer tests positive for a disease. Followed by a few sentences before showing a picture of the plaintiff, the juxtaposition constitutes defamation by implication that the plaintiff was an adult performer who contracted a virus. Okay, so they're citing a case, something that's happened before, where there was an article and it was published to the public. And the article published to the public said something along the lines of, entire corn industry has to shut down because this girl got this virus. And then you scroll through the article and you see they have a picture of this girl. But this girl sued them because she's not in the corn industry at all. They just went and found a random picture of a random girl and put it on their article about the corn industry and a highly stigmatized virus. So the girl sued and she won. And she won because the implication was she was the corn industry actress who had contracted the highly stigmatized virus. So in this Dan Schneider lawsuit, they're relying on that case law. They're saying, hold up, wait, look, when that lady sued, that was implication. And that's the same thing they did to me in this documentary, or at least an analogous situation. Let's read on. Then they cite one other case here in the same paragraph, Westmoreland versus CBS, and it says editing of a documentary to create a false and defamatory impression can constitute defamation, but it doesn't necessarily, right? And not to get too much in the weeds here, but this I believe is a little bit, and none of this is legal advice, okay? I'm not licensed to practice law. I do not represent clients. I am not in any way involved in this case. I'm a member of the public who happens to have gone to law school, opining on this case that I'm reading pretty much for the first time today. Okay, this is not legal advice. If you find yourself in need of legal advice, please consult an attorney licensed to practice law in your jurisdiction, and that is not me. Okay, and defamation lawsuits are kind of like audience specific, meaning because they depend on a statement which was published to a third party. In this case, the third party is the general public. I mean, anybody who could log into Max or Investigation Discovery or whatever was the audience for this documentary. So in a lot of cases, you might have heard people be like, okay, what would a reasonable person think or whatever? That's not the standard here. Here, the standard is not a reasonable person. The standard is Dan Schneider has to show that the claim would be considered defamatory by who? An average or ordinary viewer. So Dan Schneider has to show in court that an average or ordinary member of the audience who could see this documentary, which is just anybody in the general public, the average ordinary person would have watched this documentary or this trailer and left away with the impression that Dan Schneider is a child abuser and or Dan Schneider is a criminal, an average or ordinary person. Okay, so think about the average and ordinary intelligence of the average and ordinary person. And that's where Dan Schneider might actually start to gain a little bit of traction in this lawsuit, unfortunately, because what is the average ordinary person going to leave away from the documentary thinking about Dan in particular? Don't answer that question. Just keep it in your mind as we go through the things that Dan now says he has a problem with. Okay, So the first thing that Dan takes issue with, he spends this whole section right here talking only about the trailer. Up through page 8, all of this is about the trailer only, okay? So as you can see, the trailer, what's his issue with it? Well, it was widely disseminated, meaning a lot of people saw it. It clearly concerned Dan Schneider, which is one of the elements. I mean, it has to concern Dan Schneider. It falsely stated or implied Dan Schneider is a criminal and a child user. Okay. Again, we're only talking about the trailer right now. And this trailer came out in February. So the trailer came out February and then the actual documentary came out the next month. So for a while, several weeks, I guess, the trailer just stood alone as its own thing and caused a lot of gossip and speculation and stuff like that. And I don't know if I'll be able to include the trailer or not. If I can, I'll include it right here. If I cannot, I'll put a link in the description below because sometimes those do get copyright claimed. But even without watching the trailer, we'll be able to get through some of the things that they took issue with. It says in the first 38 seconds of the 2.5-minute trailer, they set the stage for the defamatory statements and insinuation of Schneider's purported child abuse by hammering the connection between Schneider and the child audience and cast members. Then they kind of give you a play-by-play. In the first 5 seconds, the trailer describes Nickelodeon as kid everything before showing video clips of child audience and cast members.
In the early 90s, Nickelodeon was kid everything. And you better hope that your house had cable.
Wasn't there to educate you. We were there to have fun, to get slimed, to be entertained.
The trailer then juxtaposes those children with its target, Schneider.
And this is when Dan Schneider arrives, Nickelodeon's golden boy.
And his work with the children. There's even a voiceover quote stating, quote, "This is when Dan Schneider arrives, Nickelodeon's golden boy. He created these shows that were hugely successful for them."
He created these shows that were hugely successful for them.
The trailer cuts to a video of Schneider being interviewed explaining no one had ever really done sketch comedy by kids for kids.
No one had ever really done sketch comedy starring kids for kids.
The voiceover continues to emphasize Schneider's connection to children, flashing pictures of him with a number of well-known child actors while stating, "He launched the careers of child actors who became major stars. For 20 years, he shaped children's entertainment and culture."
He launched the careers of child actors who became major stars.
For 20 years, he shaped children's entertainment and culture.
Thank you for being here.
But the trailer continues, showing additional video of Schneider looking directly into the camera. Then they say at the 39-second mark, this flashes on the screen. And see, it says ID and it says true crime event.
That marked one of the darkest chapters.
Now, this is one of those implication situations. They're saying the implication between the fact that they tried to connect and link Schneider and his work with children, followed by the words true crime event, could not be more clear. So they're saying the implication couldn't be clearer. And what is the implication that is apparently defamatory? Schneider committed a crime, a true crime, and one involving children. Then the lawsuit goes on to state this is false. Also, the fact that it's an ID logo, it emphasizes the false defamatory implication further because it is a network dedicated to true crime documentaries. That the trailer is stating or implying that the true crime involves Schneider is also clear. Now, this part right here is something that I find to be pretty compelling on the part of Dan Schneider. This is a pretty compelling part of the argument, in my opinion. What they're doing is they're pointing out, they say, look, in the 42 seconds that lead up to that true crime graphic, like so in the 42 seconds leading up to this right here where it says ID true crime event, Schneider is not only the main focus, he is the sole focus. So they're saying, look, the documentary hadn't even come out yet. It's just a trailer. And the trailer comes out, in the first 40 seconds of this trailer, it's focusing on Dan Schneider only. They don't mention another person's name before you get this ID true crime event. And so they're not saying Brian Peck was there. They're not saying Josh Handy was there. They're not saying nothing else. It's just 40 seconds of Dan Schneider and children. And then it says a true crime event. So an average ordinary viewer of the trailer would think Dan Schneider's a criminal and has something to do with kids. I think that might be true. I think that might be true. I think if you got in a time machine and rewinded back to the first time you saw that trailer and the documentary had not yet come out, and you're only watching the first 40 seconds and it's Dan Schneider, Dan Schneider, Dan Schneider, and then boom, ID, true crime event. Some of y'all were even saying, did you see they were going to be doing a Dan Schneider documentary? So I think that might be true. But that's not enough to prove defamation. I mean, there's all those other elements we've already gone through. So don't think just because I'm saying I think this one little statement might be true, that means he's going to win his case. That's not what I'm saying. Also, my opinion doesn't make one difference whether he wins his case or not. It's going to come down to a jury or they might settle. And in those elements, if you will recall, this whole thing is hinging upon the fact that they're going to have to prove that this was implied defamation, which the more examples of this implication you can give, the better it's going to be to try and win this difficult to win case. So another little example they give here is that someone said this quote, working for Dan was like being in an abusive relationship.
Working for Dan was like being in an abusive relationship.
His treatment of people on his shows was an open secret.
Dan's treatment of people on his shows was an open secret.
And this part I don't think is that strong of an argument. The phrase an open secret is a loaded phrase. Not coincidentally, An Open Secret is a 2014 documentary film that exposed child abuse in the film industry in California. The film had nothing to do with Schneider and does not mention him in any way. This right here, I just disagree. So what, nobody can say something is an open secret anymore because somebody named a documentary that? When the documentary was named that, I am certain that an open secret was already a turn of phrase. So I think they're getting a little slippery slope. They're getting a little attenuated on this argument right here, but that's my opinion. So then they just go on to kind of give more examples of this type of stuff. We're not going to go into every single one, but it's just stuff like that. Some of the arguments, like I said, this one right here, I think is pretty strong. Some of the arguments I don't really find to be that compelling, like this open secret thing, but they just basically give a smattering. They throw it all against the wall, in other words. They provide a few pictures, kind of reminiscent of the P. Diddy Lil Rod lawsuit, where the trailer shows Dan working on a show, and then somebody's asking, how safe can any kid be in that environment?
It was so devastating.
How safe can any kids be in that environment?
The false implication is clear. Dan Schneider abused child actors on his shows. Then they go on to say there would be even bigger problems down the line with actual bleep bleep on set.
There would be even bigger problems down the line with actual pedophiles on set. These are 3 predators who worked at Nickelodeon, all in a short amount of time.
And again, I think this is a pretty strong argument. The fact that they're saying there were actual PDFs on set and they're flashing pictures of Dan Schneider. And they're really driving in this Dan Schneider, Dan Schneider, Dan Schneider, flashing the picture situation. But the voiceover quotes that they are talking about don't apply to Dan Schneider, like the guy that was convicted, that's Brian Peck, or, Josh Handy. And then they say, once Brian Peck is finally mentioned, all they say is Peck.
Files on set. These are 3 predators who worked at Nickelodeon, all in a short amount of time.
I had no idea what I was saving my son from. It was a house of horrors.
They find this enormous trove of pornography.
The officer said we found Ziploc bags.
11 charges of child sex abuse related to a child actor.
It made me wonder who.
They don't say Brian Peck. They don't really introduce him. And once he's mentioned, it's like 2 minutes. And they say his full name is not stated or shown. And his image isn't shown. There's no reason for an average or ordinary viewer to notice it, let alone draw the conclusion that it was Brian Peck and not Schneider who had committed the crimes against a child. And then they say, by this point, the end of the trailer, the damage defendants intended was already done. When the trailer closes with a former child actor victim being asked if he had ever told his story publicly before.
Have you ever told your story publicly before?
The implication remains that it was Schneider who perpetrated the crime, another fabrication. So at the end of the trailer, it's like Drake Bell being like, I've never told my story before, but they never say that the story he's about to tell is about Brian Peck. Like, don't y'all remember when y'all watched the trailer, you didn't know who Drake Bell was going to expose? It could have been Dan Schneider. It could have been Brian Peck. Who knew? I didn't know. Actually, to be honest, I did assume that it was going to be Dan Schneider. Now, again, that doesn't mean that I think this is a winning argument. I just think it is compelling. Everything has to be taken into consideration. So the fact that they did air not only 1, but 2 episodes wherein Drake Bell talked extensively about his experience and the fact that Dan Schneider, actually he defended Dan Schneider. He said Dan Schneider was nice to him. Dan Schneider never hurt him, never did anything untoward. And so, in my opinion, any harm that could have possibly been done by the trailer, I think was more than fixed with the actual airing of the documentary. Again, I don't know. I have no idea. This is a commentary channel, y'all. So then after they talk about the trailer, they do talk in the lawsuit, Dan talks in the lawsuit about the Quiet on Set documentary. And again, he kind of says some of the stuff they say in this documentary is true. Some of it's true. I did some deranged and effed up stuff, but none of it had to do with abuse against children. And now I am not able to do what I want to do. I'm not able to enjoy and, pursue my life, liberty, and my pursuit of happiness because of what these people have said about me. So something he spends a lot of time on is kind of saying like, look, at the end of the first episode, like there's a whole episode. And at the very end, there's like a news reporter voice that comes on and the reporter is talking about police officers that have arrested a suspected child charged with bleep and bleep, a bleep-year-old girl, but officers believe there may be more victims. And then in the end, the editing at the end of this first episode, they make these allegations and then the TV screen kind of cuts to static, black and white static, and then that's the end of the first episode. And Dan Schneider and his lawyer are basically saying this, again, just like the trailer, this cliffhanger type of thing, that left the ordinary viewer to think that the person they were about to expose was going to be Dan Schneider. And it wasn't until people had to watch the second episode, or if they did actually ever watch the second episode, that they would finally be told that the convicted predator was not Dan Schneider, but was in fact Brian Peck. So they take issue with that. He goes on to take issue with the fact that they conflated him and Brian Peck. They kind of said, well, because Brian Peck was on set, then that must mean Dan Schneider knew about it. Dan Schneider was aiding and abetting Brian Peck's behavior. And Dan is saying that none of that is true. Now, it will be interesting. It will be very interesting to see if this does go to trial and to see if this does come out. Because as we have found out in other defamation cases recently, if you get sued for defamation, but then you can prove that the thing that you said the person did, they actually did do, you will win. So for Dan Schneider, this is a very tricky business that he is operating in right now, because right now he can reliably say he's never been charged, convicted, or found in a court of law in any way to be a child predator. But let's say somebody comes, maybe, I don't know, Amanda Bynes, who knows, somebody, let's just say hypothetically, somebody comes and does get on that stand and does say, Dan Schneider is a child S predator. Here's the proof. Here's my testimony. Here's the tapes. Well, now it's been shown in court that Dan, it can make it way worse for him. That being said, maybe Dan Schneider never accused anybody. Maybe he's telling the truth. I don't know. Like I always say, innocent until proven guilty. I can have my own opinions in my mind of speculations of what I think might have happened, what he might be about. I certainly think that the jokes that he was writing were horrendously inappropriate. And I do believe and think, I don't know, I wasn't there, but I believe and think that he knew exactly what he was doing. All that being said, I wasn't there. I don't know if he did anything with, to, about, or by, around a child. That being said, Sony is one of the defendants in this case. And y'all know that they're going to pull out all the stops. I wouldn't be surprised if Sony is going to hire a private investigator to go and find victims or alleged, or maybe even make them in a factory girl. I don't know. Y'all know, this stuff is crazy out here. So that's pretty much the gist of the lawsuit. Now, he is claiming that the damages against him are in the excess of $35,000. He's adamant throughout the entire lawsuit. He's never harmed a child. He's not a child S, not a child S predator. And in the harm section, remember how I told y'all he's going to have to prove that he was actually harmed? Well, in that harm and injury section, he does say that he actually did. Remember whenever we were watching his fake flop apology and I was like, this is Dan Schneider, like trying to do another show. Like I just feel it in my bones. He wants to go back on set with with children. And he's doing all this stupid stuff about a psychologist, making sure that kids really want to be on set and I don't know, kind of stupid stuff. Again, y'all can go and watch that video if you want to, but he does confirm my suspicions about that in this lawsuit. Let me show you what I mean. So as you can see on page 17 of the complaint, there's a section entitled Schneider was harmed. It gives the regular language that his reputation and career were irreparably harmed by the trailer and by the documentary. And Dan and his lawyer do seem to kind of reference some of these YouTube videos a little bit, kind of. I don't know. Maybe they're not. It is a little ambiguous, but we know Dan Schneider likes to do that from his jokes he used to tell, in my opinion. I don't know. I wasn't there, girl. I don't know. Look at paragraph 51. In recent years, there have been rumors rumors about Schneider and his shows, including that certain jokes taken out of context from hundreds of hours of television. So if you do hundreds of hours of television, it gives you the right to do a couple jokes, I guess. So he's saying in recent years, there have been rumors that the shows and the jokes were intentionally inappropriate. And then Dan's like, but that's not the case. It's not even true, these little rumors. And it says these rumors were primarily posted by anonymous users on fringe social media sites and do not come remotely close to the severe impact of the defamatory statements in Quiet on Set and its trailer. In stark contrast, these statements are made by the largest media companies in the world via one of the world's largest platforms, namely Max, like HBO Max or whatever. It says the docuseries and the trailer opportunistically seized upon and egregiously expanded and embellished these rumors by going so far as to falsely state or imply that, as a matter of fact, Schneider abused children on his shows and committed crimes in this regard. Thus, defendants have caused him to suffer the damages described. And at almost the very end of the complaint, it says in paragraph 69. So here's where they kind of confirm what I was suspecting in his fiasco flop faux apology. Dan says, or his lawyer says, in recent years, Dan has obtained valuable deals from major networks or platforms. However, due to the defamatory statements or implications in the trailer and Quiet on Set, the opportunities are now virtually impossible for Schneider to obtain, causing direct financial damages. So look, right here, he is admitting in recent years he obtained valuable deals from major networks or platforms. But because of the trailer and the Quiet on Set documentary, the opportunities are now virtually impossible for Schneider to obtain. I don't know what this means. It says he has obtained valuable deals, but because of the documentary and the trailer, they're virtually impossible to obtain. So has he obtained them? Look, they use this obtain. I don't know what this means. It seems like doublespeak or something. Like, it doesn't say that they withdrew the valuable deals. Where are the valuable deals? So he has had valuable deals, but now he lost them. He had valuable deals and they backed out. He had valuable deals. He completed them, but he can't get no new ones. I mean, I really don't know exactly what he means about that. But his prayer for relief is financial and compensatory damages. So he wants to be financially compensated for the damage to his reputation insofar as it is stopping him from being able to get valuable work in the industry. Now, I do find the irony in the situation that one of the charges being lodged against Dan Schneider in the documentary is precisely that he would blackball people from the industry if they did something that he didn't like. And so now he's suing somebody for apparently allegedly doing exactly that. I pretty much already said everything that I think as I went along, but just to do a TLDR kind of encapsulation of the whole thing, Dan Schneider has sued for defamation, alleging that this docuseries and the trailer both independently implied that he was a criminal and implied that he was a child of sorts. He's stating that both of those implications are false, and he's stating that it has harmed his reputation, it has harmed his mental and emotional well-being, and has gone so far as to interfere with his ability to support himself financially and make money. Defamation cases are generally very difficult to win. They're even more difficult to win in California, and you do expose yourself to the risk of having to pay the other party's fees if you get hit with one of those anti-SLAPP suits. And adding even more difficulty for Dan Schneider in this situation is the fact that he's not really alleging very much express, if any, express defamation. Everything that he's alleging really depends on having to piece together all these different variables and then jump into the mind and kind of assume what the ordinary or average viewer of the program would think. So even though I do think Dan Schneider does make some compelling arguments, I'm not sure his arguments are going to be strong enough to survive even an anti-SLAPP or a motion for summary judgment. And the cherry on top of all of that is Sony is one of the defendants. And I have no doubt in my mind that Sony is going to come guns blazing with some powerful, smart, and industrious lawyers who know how to get the job done. I will definitely be keeping up with this case as it moves along, and it's just another one for the books in the LA Superior Court, girl. That's all I really had for today. In the meantime, facts ain't defamation. Love you, mean it. Okay, bye.
Let me tell you something right now because I know you're watching. I will be saying everything you tried to do to me.